So if we're wanting to have a look at our different outputs and what's associated with them, if we look at our screen in the bottom left hand side, we've got our next arrow. If we press that, it will take us to our backup parameters and other available ones. If we then go down next again to our next page, it will then bring us to our output section. If we push on our outputs parameter, you'll see all of the outputs that are available for our controller at the moment and what's connected to those particular outputs. So if we look at our 4 GPOs along the top, GPO 1 has got our ORP connected to it, GPO 4 has got our pre-treat connected to it. If you look at the 5, 6 and 7, they are still a 240 volt output, but they are generally hardwired into. Our 8 to 14 are low or no voltage contacts, and our output 14 is our common alarm. If we wanted to test an output, for instance, to check if a dose pump was working, we can quite simply press our test outputs button at the top, which will then allow us to power an output or activate an output for 10 seconds. So if we wanted to test our GPO 1, we can now push GPO 1, which will then start running our ORP pump for 10 seconds and then go back and stop again. If we wanted to check a different output, then we can do that. Just select a different output that we wanted to engage and push on that particular output, and again it will only run it for 10 seconds and then stop. If we want to have a further look and see what's going on with our outputs, if we go back out of our test output section, let's choose our GPO 1 for instance, which is at component ORP. If we bring up that output, you'll notice that first it's set for GPO 1. Our mode is component, which means it is being controlled off a particular parameter. If we push component, we have 3 options. So forced off will be that there is no power or no activation for that particular output. Forced on will mean that there is constant activation or constant power going to that particular output. And component means that it's going to be linked with the parameter, so the parameter itself will control when that output is activated or powered. In most circumstances, when you're running a particular output like your ORP or pH, it will be set to component. Other options we've got up here is manual, so we can set a manual mode. If we wanted to manually run that particular output or that particular pump for our ORP, for instance, we would push our manual mode, choose how many minutes we'd want to run it for, so we want to run it for 2 minutes, and then we can push our start, which will then run that output for 2 minutes. Once it's finished that 2-minute run, it will then go automatically back to auto. And be controlled by that parameter again. That mode can be very useful for priming pumps as well as giving a manual sort of dose to our system if we needed to. If we wanted to stop that, we can go back into our parameter, push stop, and that will straight away stop that manual feed. Going back in here, again we just have our OK and cancel buttons, which we'd be using for making a choice, and go from there. If, for instance, we're running a pump, which is a pulse pump that has a no voltage contact, we would need to set up one of our GPOs to run constant 240 volt power to that pump and dose to our parameter off a no voltage contact. So if we chose GPO 3, for instance, we can set that to run forced on, which will then give the pump constant 240 volt power, and we could then plug in our no voltage contact to a spare output. So if we looked at our output 10, for instance, we could then change that to our component, which will then run off our particular parameter that we're wanting to use. And you also have the option to have an open dose or closed dose. So depending on how you need that output to either dose when the output is closed or when it is open, you can adjust that as well. So if you had that set wrong, it would then start dosing below a set point, for instance, for pH instead of above, or vice versa if you're dosing ORP or FAC. Once you've selected that on component for that particular output, so that was output 10 by the looks, make sure you go back to your parameter that you want to control that, and let's choose our FAC and change our output down the bottom to output 10. Okay, so now when we go back to our outputs setting, we will notice that our output 10 is component FAC and our output 3 is forced on.